So as you all know, I try to make 3 points. And by the way, my name is Kishore Malbani for those who are visitors. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here. 3 quick points before I turn the floor over to Dr. Vali Nasr, a friend of mine. And he's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and I hope you'll have some very good questions to pose to him, because he will be, he's going to speak about a very interesting area. Now let me begin by saying something about the School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, of which he's the Dean. They've been having classes since 1944. So they're slightly older than us, I think.
That's right.
And they have campuses in 3 different continents: SAIS Bologna, SAIS Nanjing, and its main campus in DC. They got wonderful alumni, including, he was telling me, the Secretary of Treasury, Tim Geithner, Wolf Blitzer, whom you see on CNN, is one of the alumnus of SAIS, and they have Nicholas Burns, who's now with the Kennedy School, former ambassador. And they've also had distinguished deans like Paul Bofowitz, Robert Osgood, and Jessica Einhorn. Their faculty includes globally renowned names like Francis Fukuyama, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Azar Nafisi, the author of Reading Lolita in Tehran. And the good news is that Vali and I were both discussing how the Lee Kuan Yew School and SAIS can collaborate. So after this at lunch, we will discuss how we can collaborate further. So if you have ideas on how to collaborate with SAIS, please let me know. The second point is about the topic, the Arab Spring, and of course the title itself. I wonder what you think, Vali. People feel caught, trapped, that the title has been chosen as Arab Spring, although many people believe that the results haven't been so sweet in some areas. I mean, if you take Libya as an example, clearly there are ongoing problems over there that are quite serious. So in a sense, having a discussion on the Arab Spring is very, very timely now. A lot is going on down there. Syria looks very uncertain. Latest news, Bahrain, some explosions are happening. So, all kinds of surprising things are happening. And actually, it's quite remarkable at this moment we have a global authority on the subject here on the school. And here, let me say a brief word about the speaker. He's the 8th Dean of SAIS. He's a leading scholar on the politics of the Middle East, the Muslim world, and foreign policy. He's also a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, a member of the U.S. State Department's Foreign Policy Advisory Board, and a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. By the way, most importantly, he actually suggested in his writings that the Arab Spring was coming. So he saw it coming before anybody else did, and so he can now tell us where it is going after this. Dr. Vali Nasr was born in Tehran. He and his family migrated to the United States after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Tehran. He graduated summa cum laude from the Tufts University in 1983, receives a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School, and he obtained his PhD in political science from MIT. I can carry on saying much more things about him, but he's also a remarkably well-known commentator. He's constantly referred to. I think you and I appeared together once on Farid Zakaria's program. I remember GPS in New York. So, whenever you talk about the Middle East, one of the few names that comes up regularly is Dr. Vali Nasr. So we are really delighted to have you with us. So over to you, Vali.
Let me first thank Dean Mahbubani for his kind introduction. It's wonderful being here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. It's been particularly gratifying in my number of recent trips I've had to Singapore to see how much more there is interest in the Middle East, academic level, policy level, as well as business level in Singapore, and with new institutions and research projects and students working on this area. I think Dean Mahbubani, started with a challenge as to, what do we really call what's happening in the Arab world. It started as a hopeful spring, and now increasingly feels like a chilly winter. But it's also the kind of, I think, complex historical development that requires not only historical analysis and political analysis, but but it really is a challenge to policymakers, and it's the kind of complex, complicated, global issue that institutions like Lee Kuan Yew School and SAIS ought to be putting their mind to, and essentially much of what we do in terms of training of students and work we do is really designed to deal with this kind of complexity. Now, having said that, it might sound like a cliche to say that the Arab Spring is a momentous historical development, something quite important in our lifetime. We don't know where it's going. There's a lot of difficulties and challenges on the road forward for the Arab world and for the Middle East. But there's no doubting the fact that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, probably we haven't witnessed a similar kind of a momentous change with broad consequences globally than what has happened in the Middle East since 2011. Now, as we're trying to see who would win the presidential election in the United States, regardless of what the outcome is, dealing with the outcome of the Arab Spring and dealing with the Middle East is one of the principal foreign policy challenges that would face a new administration. So we ought to really think about this, not just in terms of analyzing the past, but as good public policy people is really think about how you manage this going forward. One of the things which has been peculiar about the Middle East for a very long time is that it's been fairly happy with authoritarianism. If you looked at academic scholarship in comparative politics over the past 2 decades, whereas much that had been written in other parts of the world had to do with democracy, democratization, why does democracy happen? So, books on Latin America, on Southeast Asia, really dealt with the dynamics of change. Much of what was written on the Middle East and many of the sharper theoretical discussions had to do with resilience of authoritarianism. So why is the Middle East really bucking the trend everywhere else? Why is authoritarianism so politically stable in the region? And in fact, for a long time, we came down to this view that authoritarianism was sufficiently stable to be able to even reproduce itself in the form of dynasties, as one leader after another anointed his son to succeed him. Perhaps one explanation for why Arab Spring happened was that we sort of intuitively know that authoritarianism ultimately is not tenable, and that there is a point at which it becomes no longer viable. The real question is why did it happen at the time that it happened? But one of the most important sort of lessons of the Arab Spring is that the Middle East is not an exception to fundamental rules of politics and historical development, that we know that ultimately people in the region are interested in discussions about freedom, transparency, good government, and political change, and that contrary to expectation, religion and the role of religion in politics is not the only political discourse in the region. Now, as we think about, why did the Arab Spring happen at the time that it did, the focus often comes down to economic issues. And we know that the Arab world had very weak and slow rate of economic growth, that its economies were dominated by the public sector, that government-controlled economies were not producing jobs, they were not growing the economy rapidly enough. The Arab world actually was, in real terms, in a negative growth cycle. So much of the Arab world was growing much slower in real terms than it was in the 1970s or the 1980s. That it also was by and large outside of globalization. So, Dean Mahbubani was telling me that his new book is dealing with convergence in the world, and you could say basically that the Middle East was not converging and where it matters, which is economically. Now, selling oil and buying finished products is not really globalization. That's sort of a degree of barter trade. I think the fundamental rule of globalization is if in America you went into Walmart whether you find goods that are says is made in a particular part of the world. And you don't find many things that says it's made in the Arab world. In fact, if you set aside the numbers for oil and gas exports, the collective trade of the Arab world would equal those of Finland in 2000. That's how small a part of the global economy it was. Now, if we thought about where does growth in Southeast Asia, in China, in Latin America, and Eastern Europe come from, it's by and large from trade. I mean, nowadays we talk about these economies, large economies like India or China growing on the back of domestic consumer expansion. But the period of very rapid economic growth that really transformed these regions of the world, that growth happened on the back of trade. So if you're not trading, you're not growing, by and large, in real terms. And that became a major dilemma of the Arab world. Now, we sort of intuitively understood this after 9/11 to be one of the causes for the rise of Al-Qaeda and Islamic extremism, namely lack of economic growth causes social frustrations and poverty. Poverty and social frustration make extremism appealing, and ultimately this has been one of the discourses in the West as to how to get the Arab world out of that lethargy, and partly intellectually speaking, the Iraq war was justified as an outside attempt, external intervention to try to push the Arab world in the direction of embracing democracy and political and economic openness. It didn't work out quite that way. But when the Arab Spring happened, the assumption in the West was that now the region was doing that on its own. So what happened was that, as you saw on your television screens, a fruit seller in Tunisia who was frustrated with economic circumstances set himself on fire. That led to a spread of protests, first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, Libya, and across the Arab world. And the argument was that bad economics, public sector dominated economics, causing poverty, ultimately led to a rebellion of the have-nots against the oppressive political system that wasn't able to deliver. This has been compounded by another economic factor in the region, which is its demography, which is that the Middle East is a particularly young area of the world. Only Africa equals the Middle East in terms of its youth numbers. So you look at the statistics, country after country in the Middle East has 65% of its population categorized as youth, which means 25 and under, and in some countries the teenage portion of that number is actually quite high, and that basically tells you that slow-growing economies are going to face a crash because there's no way for you to produce sufficient number of jobs in order to be able to absorb the new entrance into the labor market. And that countries that have a very large number of young people and are not growing at a rapid rate get sucked into a vortex of gradually declining quality of life, particularly for young people. So you take a country like Egypt, 2 generations ago, somebody went to Cairo University, would get a bachelor's degree, would get an automatic government job, and there would be a path for them to move up the ladder to be mid-ranking or high-ranking bureaucrats, would earn enough money to be able to marry, to be able to have their own household, their own apartment, and basically function as a lower middle class / middle class bureaucrat. Nowadays, that's not possible. In other words, even the government can no longer absorb the number of people coming out of universities, and those who do get jobs don't see really a path upwards, and the salaries they collect do not support forming a household, getting married, having a house. In fact, country after country in the Middle East has extremely educated, unemployed, underemployed manual laborers. The fruit seller who set himself on fire in Tunisia had a university degree, but that was what his occupation was. And the youth bulge we associated always with one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda and extremism was popular in the region. Young people without jobs, without anything to do, are prime targets for recruitment into radical causes. Well, we didn't anticipate in the West that they could also be a force for democratization and political revolt. Now, there were, in addition to these sort of what you would say, very intuitive reasons why Arab Spring happened, namely too much authoritarianism, too weak an economic growth, and a demographic youth bulge. They were unexpected, if you would, outside events that happened that were essentially trigger mechanisms for why this happened when it did in 2011. The first of these is a technology revolution. We often sort of associate the Arab Spring with the role of social media, Facebook and Twitter, but in reality, the most important technological development in the region that made this possible was introduction of smartphones and expansion of telecommunication services that allows data transfers. That was very important because use of social media requires data services, and use of imagery and videos requires smartphones. So if you went back to 2009 in Iran, there's a lot of talk about the role that Twitter played in that uprising. It really didn't. It only played a role when people got home at night to tweet to the outside world. But in reality, Iran's telecommunication system then did not support transfer of data. So you couldn't use Twitter in Iran in 2009. But between 2009 and today, Iran of 2009 and Syria of 2011, 2012, the quality of telecommunication is significantly different. And that's really the disruptive political technology here. And the second important technology here is satellite television, which made for ubiquitous distribution of what smartphones could record and could upload. And these two made for a kind of information sharing within societies and outside societies across the Arab world that was unique. The second outside factor was and this is still ongoing, which is the impact that environmental change and global warming is having on the Middle East. We often don't really think, we are very concerned about global warming, extreme weather, climate change. We have a lot of debates about it. There are a lot of university programs, research money, but we really don't usually put it in the same bucket as the political, historical, social issues that we usually discuss. And in the case of the Arab Spring, they do come together. There was, because of shifts in weather, there was wheat shortage the year before Arab Spring started. The price of wheat spiked drastically in Egypt in 2011. In a country which in January of 2011, 40% of its population lived on $2 a day. There was a great deal of price sensitiveness to price of basic staples like bread. And some of the anger had to do with the price of bread. In the years leading up to the uprising in Syria, the country has gone through monumental droughts that people say, there hasn't been comparable drought in Syria for as long as people remember, going back even decades, if not longer. And these have created certain disruptions. So if the argument is why 2011 and why not 2010, it has a lot more to do with the pressure that climate change brought on food security, and food security has been a sort of a very underrated but extremely important causal factor in the Arab Spring. And it's not going to go away. I mean, the region still is facing water scarcity and food scarcity, and next year actually the assumption is that the price of food is going to go up globally again, which means that it's going to hit countries like Egypt very hard. And the lesson for the rest of the world is that these things do matter to political stability. And so what happens in agriculture and climate is not divorced from what happens in politics. Now, the other issue, which is actually interesting, is that the Arab Spring did not happen because there was poverty. The Arab Spring actually happened because there was good news in the Arab world. So if you looked at the country where Arab Spring began, Tunisia, it was very different from the rest of the Arab world. Tunisia, many people said for a very long time, was Middle East's China. It was growing at tiger rates of 7 to 9% a year throughout the 1990s. It had an authoritarian regime, but it also had a very successful economy. I mean, when I was doing research on my book, everybody would tell me, well, what about Tunisia? It's a very successful China model in the Middle East. And also its profile was nothing like the rest of the Arab world. Literacy rates are in the 70 to 80%. The size of the middle class is at least, people say, 50% of the population, based on very rudimentary counting of how much disposable income a family has after they spend for food and housing. And some people put it as much higher than that, the majority of Tunisians being categorized as middle class. It actually was part of globalization. It's the only Arab country that in a realistic way was part of globalization. In other words, Tunisia was a lot more like Philippines or Bangladesh than it was like Egypt. It really had an integrated economic and financial relationship through migrant labor and tourists with Europe. There were European companies who actually built things in Tunisia and then exported them to Europe, including Airbus industry, which manufactures parts of its fuselage in Tunisia. So, I mean, it was much more like, the story is much more like countries all around us, depending on exports, trying to get direct foreign investment, all of that. And what was the consequence of it? The consequence is that Tunisia actually produced a middle class. Middle class, like middle classes everywhere, they want quality of life, they want political freedoms, they want cultural freedoms, they want to be integrated into the global middle class culture. And they have the same consumption and political interests of middle classes, generally speaking, everywhere else. So in Tunisia, it was poverty that led a fruit seller to set himself on fire. But that would have been a tree falling in the forest. Nobody would have noticed it, was it not for the very affluent Tunisian youth who didn't have a problem with bureaucracy, didn't have a problem with poverty, were very well-to-do. It's they who made Tunisia's revolution. So the statistics is that when Arab Spring happened, when the revolts in Tunisia happened, 20% of all Tunisians were on Facebook, which is a much higher portion of any European country at that time, maybe barring Scandinavian countries, and was definitely multiples of what the Facebook participation was in the United States at the time. Now that's not, that doesn't mean Facebook made the revolution. It says something about Tunisia. Because if you were on Facebook on Tunisia at that time, meant you were globalized culturally, you were affluent, you had access to the internet, and you were literate sufficiently to be able to be on Facebook. And Facebook would allow to create really a middle-class virtual political community. And that we would see that repeated across the Arab world. So, the real contribution of Facebook is to empower the middle class, if you would, through information sharing. And if you went to Egypt, which is the country next door where Arab Spring went next, is that Mubarak's 30-year rule, by and large, was what we expected: dictatorial and economically lethargic and closed. Except the last part of his rule, he actually began to open up the economy. So the last years of Mubarak was a lot more like last years of Suharto in Indonesia. There was authoritarianism all along, but he actually began to open up the economy, began to privatize. Yes, there was cronyism, but there was plenty of cronyism in Indonesia's privatization in its early years as well. But the consequence of that of privatization was Egypt actually began to grow around 7 to 9% for a intense period of 5 years, leading up to 2010. And during that time period, it did produce a new middle class, which was again played the same role as the middle class in Tunisia. So, the face of the Egyptian revolution was a young executive at an American multinational company, Wael Ghani. And that's not coincidental. That is about the agency of this critical middle class that itself was the product of the beginnings of privatization and globalization in the Middle East. Now, the problem here is also goes with when you are converged in the world, which is it happened in Tunisia because Tunisia was part of globalization, was also sensitive to economic downturn in Europe. So when the European crisis hit in 2008, tourists disappeared, exports began to plunge, and immediately Tunisia imported the global financial crisis into the country, and that proved to be politically problematic. Had Tunisia and Egypt started privatization a decade earlier, they may have passed the critical stage before everything fell apart. Now, once the Arab Spring happened, there was good news, and there's still that good news is there. Namely, the Arab world and many parts of it for the first time began to have real politics in it, which is a real discussion among the population about accountability, transparency, representation, right to participation in politics. The public space in the Arab world, which had been emptied of people, was re-engaged. There was serious debates about how to define an Arab anew based on the values of the Arab Spring. And, that's still there. That discourse, that, desire to be heard, to be expressed, to be engaged in politics is still very much there. Yes, it's not been consolidated in the very clear democratic institutions, but we don't know, what this sort of citizen engagement in the Arab world will mean intellectually, ideologically, and politically, but it definitely was a welcome introduction to Arab politics. Now, having said that, there are a number of unexpected outcomes and sources of worry, at least in the short run. So the first of these is that the Arab Spring did not produce very clear leadership. There is no Nelson Mandela or Václav Havel here. There's also no Nasr or Khomeini here. There is no defining leader who can give this direction one way or the other. This was not a movement that was created by leaders. And even in country after country, those who've come to power were product of the revolution, not its leaders. So the president of Egypt, the prime minister of Libya, the prime minister of Tunisia, these are essentially people that have now been propelled to power based on the institutions that they occupy. So Morsi in Egypt is who he is because of the institution of the presidency of Egypt. He's not Gamal Abdel Nasser. He didn't make the revolution. He didn't create it. He basically is a product of the process that brought it to power. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. The advantage, as we see in Syria, is that it's very difficult to kill this off. So why doesn't Assad hasn't succeeded in destroying the opposition in Syria? It's very difficult to destroy. It's kind of like banging your hand on water. It spreads, but there's no leadership. So there's one Syrian regime, but it's confronting over 100 armed military groups and many more other political opposition groups. So it's very difficult to eliminate it. There's no hierarchy to decapitate. The downside of it is that there's no direction. There's no leadership. There's no substitute for leadership. And that is definitely part of the problem. In fact, what we're seeing in the Arab world is a very intense struggle for dominating a movement that didn't have leadership. And that brings us to the second issue, which is the groups that have now looked to be inheriting the Arab world, which is not the liberals or the middle-class youth that started it, but actually the Islamist forces of generally the Muslim Brotherhood, but then among them a much more hardline Salafi organizations. At some level, we should have seen this coming because ultimately democracy or any kind of an open political process favors those who have organizational capability and organizational structure. So liberal forces did not have it. They didn't have a leadership. They didn't have organization. But Islamist forces, whether they're hardline or moderate, have plenty of organization. They have grassroots organization. They have a social contract with the poor. They've been engaged in a give and take. And, in politics in America, they call this the ground game. You must have heard it a few days before, particularly about Ohio and Wisconsin. The ground game matters. In other words, whether you're able to work among a community to get out the vote, to have a door-to-door relationship with people, and the Islamist forces have that capability. What do they do with this is an open question as to whether we're going to see a Turkish model here, or we're going to see something else altogether. And I think the key to that is not the internal debate of Islamists. The key to that, as I would say, will be economics. Now, the third problem is the problem of particularly what we're seeing in Syria, which is sectarianism, ethnic conflict, etc. Partly the reason for that is that where Arab Spring started in Tunisia and Egypt, you have much more homogeneous Arab states where the deep social cleavages of sect and ethnicity are not dominant in the politics. You could say Arab states are more Germany's and France's. Yes, they have minorities, but there's much more of a cohesive sense of state and nation. The more east you go, the more the Arab state looks like Yugoslavia, which means that authoritarianism has been protecting a particular distribution of power among minorities. Now, issue of distribution of power among minorities or majorities is not alien to this region of the world. If you look at Malaysia and how many times it's gone through these debates about how you distribute power through entitlement programs, through distribution of seats, etc. It speaks to that. The Arab world has never gone through this exercise. So yes, at a higher level, there is a definition of the nation state, but once you look below it, nothing is really resolved. So we saw this in Iraq. So we arrived there. We said, you shatter the state. Surely, the very first thing the Iraqis are going to decide is rights of individual versus that of the state. It's going to be about democracy. And we found out, no, they have other things to settle, which is which community dominates the state. Those who lose control don't want to lose control. Those who want control are not willing to compromise. And we found that actually it's not a nice gentleman's game, and it got very bloody very quickly. The Sunnis, who were a minority ruling over Iraq, they didn't want to give up power. The Shiites had scores to settle, and the Kurds actually pretty much wanted out altogether. And by and large, when you look at Syria, it's a reverse of Iraq in some ways. It's a state that was run by a minority Alawites who got most of the share of wealth and power, dominate over Sunnis who believe they ought to be controlling the state. Lebanon has extremely unresolved issues. By many accounts, the Shiites are probably, if not the largest, one of the largest communities, but have the least amount of power. Bahrain, where we're seeing troubles again, is majority Shia ruled by minority Sunni power. Even a country like Jordan is majority Palestinian ruled by a minority of East Jordanian community. And in all of these states, this imbalance is protected by authoritarianism. You remove the authoritarianism, this issue comes out right to the fore. You end up with the Yugoslavia scenario. There's a massive balance of power recalibration that happens. So in a very ironic way, what the U.S. military did to Iraq, the Arab Spring is doing to the Arab state, which is state shattering. And we're seeing that in the case of Syria, except it's at a much slower pace than how quickly the U.S. military dismantled Saddam's regime and the Ba'athist apparatuses of power. And that's likely to continue. So how it turns out in Syria could be decisive. Now the final issue is economics in this region. The statistics for the Arab world are not good. They were not good before Arab Spring. They're not good now. The reasons why we think Arab Spring happened is we often don't associate it with the good news of a Tunisia growing and an Egypt growing, producing a middle class. That growth is gone anyway because of the breakdown of economic structures and political instability. So Egypt is no longer growing at all. In fact, its GDP shrank this year by 15%. And Tunisia is nowhere like where it was growing under Ben Ali. So that middle class's future is now open to question. But everything else, every other statistics in this region, the size of the youth, the level of economic growth is bad. So if you looked at a country like Egypt, Egypt could be 135 million people by 2025. And it's running out of water. It doesn't have a source for employment for its people. You know, the statistics don't look good for Egypt. For Egypt to avoid a sort of a Pakistan future of poverty, extremism, dysfunctional state, it has to be growing at a rate of 11% for 10 years. You have to think, where would that growth come from? And we know where that growth can come from. The only way it can come from is from globalization, which is from massive amount of economic restructuring and much more rapid integration into the global economy. Now, that's not happening, largely, I would say, because the Western world, and in many ways the American administration under President Obama, has been singularly disinterested in democracy in the Middle East. And they're singularly disinterested in any conversation that means investing economically in the region. And yes, you can give a little bit of aid to the Egyptian military or provide development aid, but the kind of massive amount of funds that went into Latin America and Eastern Europe and even into Asia after the Asian financial crisis, and the kind of economic restructuring that went along with it is singularly absent in the Middle East. And I think, just like economics was decisive in the Arab Spring happening, economics will be decisive in where it goes. And so whether the Islamists will become more moderate rather than less moderate will have to do with economics. Because we should not forget, what made Turkey's moderates moderate was Turkish integration into the global economy. It was not some debating society exercise in which one side won one set of arguments as opposed to the other. And I'll stop here.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.